Good morning. This is M.W. Moore, and I present to you Tales Told from Under the Tree at the Top of the World, with their original title and in their original format. We'll begin, of course, with the first story. That's a good place to begin. And as the story was told, good day. My name is Charles Gustav Vogt, but you can call me Charlie. Everybody does. And I should tell you that this is not my story, but I'm kind of in the story, so I'll start it with me. When I was 32 years old, actually on my 32nd birthday, I ran away from home. I had a good job in the family business. I had a very nice house that I rented for next to nothing from my aunt. I was engaged to a charming lady. The family approved. Of course, I went to the best schools, paid for with family money. I was miserable, a family tradition. When I left, I wound up in the California mountains. And I found that if you're going to be mad, it's best to be in the mountains of California or Oregon, because they like mad people. They seem to think they have something to say. Well, I lived alone on a small piece of land up in the mountains of California, and I was alone for a very short time. It seems that I wound up with 3 dogs. Another story about how they came to get their names, but they were, again, that was the first dog's name. The second dog's name was Maxwell Crabtree Blues House Sailor. And he got that name because that was the name that was on the collar that he was wearing when he wound up at my cabin. And the other was more of an aristocrat, and his name was Gustav Van Arf. But that's because he was a purebred German Shepherd, and he wound up there. And then there was, of course, the cat. At the end of a day's work, the 4 of us, Cat stayed in the cabin, the 3 dogs and I, would travel to the top of a hill, and there was a magnificent oak tree, and he was, as I like to call it, the tree at the top of the world. From its vantage point, I could look over all the other hills and into the mountains and watch the fog rolling in off the ocean. It was a beautiful place to spend the evening, alone, with the 3 dogs and some ants. But this one evening I went up. It was a beautiful evening. And the dogs ran ahead of me, which they often do. And they were curled on the opposite side of the tree from where I usually sat, and that was uncommon. And I went to see what they were looking at. They were all quite calm. And there was a very tiny man, maybe 12 inches tall, with a bright red ear and bright red hair. And in that bright red that covered most of his face, there was a tiny stem of a little pipe, and little puffs of smoke rising up. And he pulled the pipe from his mouth, and he said, "Good evening, Charlie. It's a beautiful evening, isn't it?" And my response was, little person, he said, "If you're wondering how I know your name, it's simple." He said, "Names are simple." He said, "For people like me, it's for all time, men have wondered, and Pixies just know." And he said, "I apologize." He said, "My name is Stephen Peerless Quickstep, Pixie, at your service." And he said, "As I say, names are easy, but there are some difficult things that I know." And I said, "Like calculus?" physics. No. Children can master that. I know about hard things. I even know about the times before there were fairies, pixies, or elves. Would you like to hear about it? And I said, of course. And he said, sit down, and I'll tell you the tale. He said, but first close your eyes. And I did. Keep them closed. And I did. And he said, open one eye. And I opened an eye. And I could see the stars. He said, open the other eye. And I could see more stars. And he said, look around. And the tree was gone. And there were stars all around. I thought I'd moved to the top of a hill where there weren't any trees, and I looked down at the hill, and the hill wasn't there because there was more stars. That was rather disquieting. I think I screamed. But a gentle hand on my thigh said, it's all right. It's all right. And I looked, and I could see colors I'd never seen before, stars I'd never seen before. And I looked, and I could see stars that were being born. I could see stars that were dying. And I was somewhere between there, here and there, and then, and I don't know when, and all of a sudden I started to fall. And as I started to fall, I started to panic. And I found that I had this rather strange hat. And as I tilted it one way, or tilted it the other, I started moving to the left, or moving to the right. It was rather a marvelous hat. I liked it. It was just seemed to fit me. And as I slowed down, I looked and I could see a beautiful land. Colors everywhere, flowers in magnificent profusion, and trees so tall that the clouds had to ask permission to go through them. And then I saw that this was in the calmest sea, in the warmest corner. And it was just wonderful. And I landed in this magnificent meadow, surrounded by all these colors and fragrances. And it was just not quite right. And Stephen told me, just listen carefully. And I did. And the flowers were talking. And I could hear the flowers talking to their neighbor, saying, aren't I the most wonderful color? Do you like that perfume I'm wearing today? I am just so wonderful. But flowers had very, very soft voices and really couldn't be heard, not even by their nearest neighbor. And the neighbors were bragging about how they looked. But then the flowers had visitors. The bees came. And the bees were, buzz, 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 oh, the queen, buzz, 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 and she's just, buzz, 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 I have to go, buzz, 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 buzz. And the poor soft-spoken flowers couldn't get in a word edgewise. And then the butterflies landed. And the butterflies just lightly walked across the petals and tickled their feet in the pollen. And the bees began to talk about how wonderful they were. And the butterflies never said a word. Which would be wonderful if you're trying to keep a secret, but not necessarily if you wanted to know what was going on across the meadow. So the flowers were rather frustrated. And then there were the aphids and some of the bugs that nibbled on the leaves. And they said, oh, so tasty. Which was not necessarily the compliment that they wanted to receive. But over the sound of the flowers, you could hear a booming coming from the forest. And these great trees were complaining. One wisteria that had grown close to the ear of a maple tree was complaining about the problems that he had. Look at my colors, and no one appreciates them. And the tree boomed out, "You think that you have problems? Look at me. I stand like a mountain, a giant. And what do? I support a nest of birds. It's a waste, a horrible waste." And then all the other trees in the forest started to complain as well. And as a breeze picked up, you could hear that there was the grasses humming out a song. It was overshadowed by the trees and the flowers. They were not happy with what they had. And then on the edge of the breeze was a little dust devil, whirling and twirling, and going through the forest, kicking up the leaves, and exposing little colonies of mushrooms and toadstools. They had no color, they had no fragrance. They certainly weren't as strong as the trees, so they just quietly huddled together and were content in that. But as the little whirlwind went through, it picked up one tiny mushroom seed, and it twirled around and lifted it up high, dancing in the sunlight until it sparkled like a gem. And then it just zigged and zagged among the trees and the ferns, and tickled the fur of the rabbit, and then set it down at the edge of the forest. And it was gone. Then a fog came in through the forest as night fell. And in the dawn, the sunlight started to spread the fog apart. The little seed was gone, and in its place was a teeny, tiny little mushroom of brilliant white. And it opened its eyes and it looked around, amazed at the trees and the flowers and the grasses. And it said, "Good morning." "Hello? Will somebody play with me?" And what the little mushroom didn't know was that mushrooms, not unlike flowers, had very, very soft voices. And no one heard it. So no one replied. The mushroom started to feel very alone. And he said, Will somebody be my friend? Will somebody love me?" And no one heard him. The little mushroom felt very, very sad. As children do when they're frightened or alone or sad. He began to cry. And as these teeny tiny tears from this itty bitty mushroom landed on the floor of the forest, they sounded like great claps of thunder that rocked the trees and the skies began to darken, like a great storm coming. And the winds picked up, which drowned the voices of the trees and the flowers. And the trees were afraid they'd lose a branch. And the flowers were afraid that they'd lose all their petals. And they began to cry and huddle together until one voice, one simple voice, spoke out and said, "Be quiet, you ninnies! There's a child lost." And there was a daffodil, louder than the trees, louder than the flowers, louder than the wind, and everyone was silent. "Find the child." And everyone began to look. And the flowers looked, and the grasses looked, and the trees began to look, and the rabbits and the squirrels, and even the porcupine. And they looked, and they looked. And it was a great oak tree that first saw it. He looked down on the baby, and he could yell, but that would frighten him. And it was too far away for him to really reach out. And so an oak tree that had stood in that one place for its entire life, for hundreds of years, he never moved. With the greatest of effort, he pulled up a root and stretched it out in front of him. And then he pulled another and another. And he moved from there to here until he was beside the tiny little mushroom. And he wrapped his roots around him to protect him from the wind. And he reached one branch up a little bit higher and pulled out one leaf and brought it down and rested it over the mushroom. It said, "Here, little one, this will keep you warm. Now is the time for sleep, not for tears." And the little mushroom stopped crying. And he smiled. And as he smiled, the clouds parted. The sun came up just before sunset. As the sun began to dip just below the sea, the mushroom was asleep. The flowers fell asleep. The trees fell asleep. Everything, all the land, was fast asleep. And at just that moment, a voice was heard in a beautiful garden. A garden that might have been the model for the Garden of Paradise. And that garden was the home of a great builder. And he once more walked across the land. And the music of his sweet laughter filled the dreams of every creature in the land. And when the sun came up that day, there was a difference. In the meadow there awoke a tiny creature. Bright shining eyes and bigger pointed ears. Ears that could hear the softest of voices. Eyes that could see and loved every color in the meadow. And they could also sing in perfect harmony every song of the grasses. And in the woods, They were awoke another creature, larger than the fairies, lived in the meadow, and they called themselves elves. And they looked at the trees and they saw homes, and spinning wheels, and looms, and all manner of craft. And these elves, oh, they loved the forest. Somewhere between the forest and the meadow, there awoke another creature, larger than the fairies, but not nearly as industrious as the elves, and they call themselves Pixies. And they just smiled, and they walked the land, and they looked at things, and they just knew, and they smiled. And that night, after the first dawn, the builder walked again, and he looked, and he said, "This land I will call life, and these folk I will call the Dawn People." And that is my tale.